to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Welcome to Talent Optimization. My name is Tracy Shirk, and I'm the Chief Talent Officer here at Elevated Talent Consulting. And today we are having the most amazing conversation about performance management. Grown. I know, right? But performance management does not always have to be a negative thing, right? So when we look at performance management, we're really looking at how every individual in the organization is fulfilled in their work. And guess what? You have to have accountability with that. So we have an amazing guest on our show today. We have Michele Haugh on our show today, and Michele is with us from EarlyHR Solutions, and she is the co-founder there. And EarlyHR Solutions provides personalized HR and employee engagement solutions to early and growth stage organizations. So welcome, Michele.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So when you first think of performance management, what first comes into your head?
Well, Tracy, like yourself, I've been in HR for a long time. And so when I think of performance management, like a lot of folks that have been around for a while, you do think of sort of that moaning and groaning around the annual performance review. And that's always had sort of a negative connotation and sort of a feeling of dread. But what I'm really excited about is to see sort of a paradigm shift in that performance management is just not about an annual one-sided conversation, but it's really changing more towards an ongoing process where individuals can work with their leaders and be aligned on a much more regular basis and a much less formal basis where the conversations around performance are not so scary, they're not dreaded, because it's just a method of communication and making sure that everybody is aligned and on track.
Awesome. Yeah. And I totally agree with that alignment, that accountability, having individuals on track. And actually, I was doing a training with an individual or an organization yesterday that came from a partnership with you and Early Engage. And one of the conversations that came up was really around goal setting. And when we have those goals in front of us, we can actually create much more accountable and meaningful work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, having those conversations and having some clear, measurable goals is really, really critical, because quite often what we've seen is individuals have conversations with individuals that are working for them. You want it to be informal, but there's got to be some sort of formal organization around having specific goals and, things that you're tracking on, which really helps to move the organization forward and achieving the goals that are necessary. But it also helps to drive that professional development that's really critical to keep folks engaged and to ultimately retain them. Because if you are just sort of plodding along and doing check-ins that are just oriented to just project status or just updates on immediate deliverables, you really miss an opportunity to have a conversation around how you're moving the needle in a more comprehensive way.
So I'm super curious, how do you structure those frequent conversations with staff that not only aligns the performance to what are the business objectives and outcomes of the organization, but also to an individual's professional development?
So there's really a multitude of things. I mean, again, if you keep these conversations somewhat informal, you first really want to have a check-in. How is that individual doing? How are they feeling about their work? What are the barriers that they're facing that are preventing them from being successful? Sometimes individuals are afraid of mentioning challenges because they're concerned that might be viewed as a weakness or that they're not completely on top of things. But having the ability to have those honest, candid conversations where individuals can feel comfortable and feel trusted, have that trusted relationship where they can share those challenges. It's then that the leader and the individual working for them can really work cooperatively to figure out a solution together. Because the longer those things are not being addressed or not being discussed, it's just going to snowball, and there's going to be a missed opportunity to kind of eliminate some of those barriers much more quickly and with an outcome of being much more successful a lot more quickly. So as far as, again, I think conversations traditionally are very tactical, and that's great. You certainly want to have tactical conversations when you're doing one-on-ones and checking on progress status and, projects and things like that, but also more holistically, just as far as how people are feeling. Are they feeling challenged? Are there areas that they want to potentially get more exposure to? Some of those conversations are also just really, really important. And if you have specific goals that have been identified, that also just makes that process even that much easier, because you've got something very specific that you're discussing and tracking.
Yeah, absolutely. In those one-on-ones, one of the key things that we're really seeing based on the science and based on some of the results is really bringing coaching into those conversations. And what we're finding so often is that our leadership teams don't know how to coach, right? Because as managers and leaders, we don't have to have all the answers. And yet when we have these prescripted kind of one-way conversations, staff don't always feel like they're involved in that process. And it really is that two-way conversation. So I'm curious, how are you seeing coaching as a part of performance conversations and a part of that professional development?
Coaching is huge, but it is a two-way street. And so asking individuals to kind of self-reflect, I think, is also really, really helpful, because you mentioned, Tracy, that one-way conversation. It's hard to have a true coaching collaborative conversation if it is only one-sided and you've got one person just leading the meeting and just telling someone their thoughts, or, here's what I see, here's what you need to do, and it's one way. That's not going to be very productive. But if you ask an individual to identify how they think they're doing, where they see themselves performing really well, areas that they may need help with in development, it becomes much easier to have that dialogue, and the coaching process becomes much easier because it's more of a collaboration versus a one-way directed conversation.
Absolutely. And the coaching conversation, like you said, is huge, and it's focusing on the strengths. I just had a conversation with Mike Zani, the CEO of Predictive Index, and he talks about the importance of coaching and coaching towards strengths in his new book called The Science of Dream Teams. And if you're curious about that, you can go back a couple episodes and listen into our conversation on the podcast. But this coaching through the organization of really asking the questions of, hey, you know what, we had this deadline, what happened, right? Like,
exactly.
Is there something that we maybe could have helped with? And we've got these goals coming up over the next 3 months. What do you need in order to be successful? Because so often the fear in our heads manifests itself in really ugly ways that stop us from reaching our goals. That when we step back and collaborate, it completely changes the conversation, the feelings that go along with it, like you were just talking about, and the outcomes that we're getting.
Absolutely. I mean, if a leader can express that they are there to help remove barriers or to help find solutions, there's going to be that element of trust, which is so critical. And the more trust there is in that relationship, there's going to be a much higher level of engagement and ultimately a level of performance. And that's just really critical. In fact, I just did an exit interview with someone yesterday. And although they were moving on to a new opportunity, they just had the most wonderful things to say about the person that they were working for. And I just found that so refreshing. But one of the things that they just kept repeating is that not only was this individual that they worked for really, really sharp from a technical aspect, and they taught them and mentored them so much, but that they were really just a kind and empathetic individual, and that they always just truly cared about how the individual is feeling and where they could help them to be more successful. And so, having those honest conversations are really critical. And when I say honest, sometimes the honesty may not be positive, and that's the greatest gift that you can give somebody in a relationship, whether it's a work relationship or a personal relationship. Having that honesty and not harboring something is really critical. And we often see some of these issues crop up in organizations. We do a lot of coaching of leaders in organizations that are managing performance issues. And what we find is where there's really challenging situations is when they've sort of been beating around the bush a little bit, maybe trying to be too nice. And being nice is in the end not really kind, because you really are not helping this individual by not being, really truthful and realistic. And so having those honest conversations, even if they may be tough or difficult, the sooner you have them, the better off the results are going to be. And it's really just the feedback. Feedback is free, and it's the most powerful, impactful component of a successful relationship. So having those conversations early and frequently is really, really critical to having, really great outcomes.
Absolutely. And you know what? Sometimes the organization is not the best fit for the individual, right? Because we have to have staff inside of our organizations that are meeting the performance objectives and are engaged in the work, right?
Exactly.
If they're not engaged in the work and meeting the performance objectives, they're not going to be one of those key champions and star players in our organization. So we want to make them happy alumni, right? We cannot create happy alumni without really honest conversations, right? Feedback is a gift as long as you view it that way. But we also have to approach it that way, right? Like if we're working with somebody that's super, super introverted, we cannot spring something on them. We have to kind of send them something in writing that says, hey, we're going to have a performance conversation. Here's the 3 key points we're going to talk about. I want you to think about this ahead of time so we can actually engage in that conversation, right?
Yes,
and for
absolutely.
my extroverted folks, we can just have a conversation, but we need to make sure that we're meeting folks where they are, because performance has a key impact on so many variables, right? It's what's my relationship with my manager? It's, am I in the right job? It's, are we in a culture that aligns with who they are individually? And am I on a team where there's trust and cohesion and collaboration? Any one of those things is off, we could have bad performance, and it's not because they're a bad person or they're not great at something. But guess what? Every one of us is created perfectly the way we are. We are not created perfectly for every job.
That's right. Exactly. That's for sure.
So one of the things you talk about is self-reflection and minimizing gaps between the manager expectations and employee performance. Do you want to chat a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So again, when I think of performance management, it's truly about alignment. And when there's misalignment, that's when issues are going to occur, or goals will not be able to be achieved, because you've got a leader who has directives from the organization. They've got organizational goals, departmental goals. And then you've got an individual who may or may not really truly understand those goals and how they fit. And it's really, really critical that there aren't gaps between what the manager, the leader, is expecting from the individual contributor, because that's just going to really create a lot of issues. So it's just critical that the expectations are very clear, and that there's an understanding that the individual has also done some self-reflection to really understand where they are performing and seeing if there are gaps. Maybe they think they're a rock star in a particular area, and the manager, is not on the same page. They don't think that they're a rock star and they need to hear some honest feedback. Or perhaps maybe you've got an employee that is super nervous and they think they're doing a terrible job and maybe they're actually performing, at a top level, but they just don't have that awareness. So having that honest conversation around where the expectations are and where that individual is fitting into those expectations is really critical. And when there's a misalignment, it's really, really hard to be as successful as you could be.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about that feedback, 360 reviews can be so powerful because it's then not just coming from, that manager. And there's a ton of HBR articles, Harvard Business Review articles out there right now, and Forbes, et cetera, talking specifically about how the look of performance management is really changing and how so often those annual performance reviews are more of a reflection of the manager versus the employee, right? So when we can pull in those 360-degree reviews and really calibrate what those reviews look like amongst the organization and remove some of those biases, along with ensuring we're having that trusting, ongoing, honest conversation throughout the year, what we're doing is we're building a really strong relationship of alignment to the same goals.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because it really does. It reduces the gap between what the expectations are and what's actually happening, right? And if someone believes they're that key rock star and they're not, it may be that, hey, they're a rock star in one area, but there's all these other duties as assigned that are on top that is not their strength. So it's like they were alive and amazing and had a full bank account when they came into our organization, but we killed them throughout the process by giving them all these things that drain their energy. And I think as organizations and leaders, we have to own our part of employee performance as well as that collaborative relationship with them.
Yeah. And sometimes those gaps are solvable. Maybe there are some things that can be just changed around, or there may be some things that are kind of low-hanging fruit. And then there are going to be situations where it's just not going to work because the gap is too big and the individual just will never be meeting the expectations that are necessary for that particular role. But sometimes there's really a happy medium and they just need that coaching and support to kind of move the needle in the right direction.
Absolutely. So as we start to close our conversation for today, I'm curious, what's one takeaway you have for executives listening in today?
Well, I would just say, again, the performance management, let's kind of change what that means. Let's not think of it as this painful yearly process and think of it more of just alignment. How do we stay aligned as a business and through our relationships with our team members? And the more that we are aligned, the better we're going to perform as an organization. And the only way to have that alignment is to have frequent, honest conversations. And if those conversations are happening on a regular basis and there is some structure around them so that folks have some goals that they can count on working towards achieving, there's going to be a lot more success. So I know there are some leaders that are really, really great about keeping those one-on-one meetings, having really productive meetings. And then there are some leaders that aren't. They get really caught up in other day-to-day tasks, and maybe they get canceled and then they get canceled again. And I would just say that, of course, you're going to have to cancel every now and then, but every time you cancel those meetings with the folks that work for you, it really sends a message that they might interpret as you not caring or they're not being supported in the way that they need. So I would just say, let's make it a priority. Let's not make it overly complicated, and let's just focus on that alignment. So that would be my primary takeaway for executives. And just make it, like I said, make it a priority.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's a key takeaway for HR practitioners listening in today?
I would just say, again, be open to new ideas, maybe stepping away from the old school form that people dread, and really trying to drive your organization towards having these conversations around alignment and, maybe ditching some of the old-fashioned practices that just don't work all that well, and encouraging leaders to have those frequent conversations. And if they don't know how to have them, then as an HR person, that's an opportunity for you to add value to the organization to help make that process easy for them. It doesn't have to be, a 5-page document. There could be a couple key goals or conversational talking points, but making it easy and educating and supporting your managers is going to be really critical to drive an effective performance management process.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And if you are curious to learn more about EarlyHR Solutions, we will have their website and Michelle's LinkedIn profile in our show notes so that you have that. Michele will also be joining us for one of our upcoming live webinars within our Talent Optimization Foundation programs for some very specific kind of tips of, hey, how do you have these conversations? What does that look like? So thank you so much for joining us in our Talent Optimization podcast, and we hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.